They say you never truly know a person until you catch them being someone completely different. My name is Danielle Whitmore. I'm 34 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville, Illinois. I drive a white Lexus. I volunteer at my daughter's school every other Friday. I bring casseroles to church potlucks. I have a husband who kisses me on the forehead every morning before he leaves for work. And until 8 months ago, I was absolutely certain, not kind of certain, not mostly certain, but 100% certain that I had a good marriage. Then my sister called me from 37,000 feet in the air. She was flying the aircraft. She wasn't supposed to call anyone mid-flight. She's a first officer for one of the largest commercial airlines in the country, and there are rules. Very strict rules about personal calls during service. But she called me anyway, because what she saw in seat 3B of that business class cabin made every single rule feel irrelevant. And after today, after you hear everything that happened, I think you'll understand exactly why she picked up that phone. It was a Tuesday in October. One of those gorgeous Midwest fall days where the sky is so blue it almost looks fake, and the leaves are doing that dramatic orange and red thing that makes you feel like everything is fine. Everything is beautiful. Everything is exactly as it should be. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking my second cup of coffee, scrolling through Pinterest looking at Thanksgiving table settings, because that is the kind of woman I was. The kind who planned holiday tablescapes 2 months early. My husband, Troy, had left for work at 7 that morning. He was a regional sales director for a medical device company. His job required travel, sometimes a lot of it. That week, he had told me he was flying to a conference in Atlanta. 3 days. He'd be back Thursday night. I had no reason to doubt him. Troy traveled 4, sometimes 5 times a month. It was normal. It was Tuesday. I was looking at linen napkin folds on Pinterest. Then my phone rang. My sister Reese. Now you have to understand something about Reese. She is not a dramatic person. She doesn't call to gossip. She doesn't catastrophize. She is the most level-headed, methodical human being I have ever known in my life. Which makes complete sense, because she flies 180-ton aircraft for a living. You don't panic at 37,000 feet. You assess, you communicate, you act. That is who Reese is. So when I picked up the phone and heard her voice cracked and strange, something in my stomach went cold before she even said a single word. "Danny," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be calm." I set down my coffee cup. "What's wrong? Is Troy traveling this week?" My brow furrowed. "Yeah, he's in Atlanta. Conference." "Why?" There was a pause. Just 2 or 3 seconds. But it felt like a whole minute. "Danny," she said carefully, "I'm on a flight right now. I'm not supposed to be calling, but I'm looking at our passenger manifest, and Troy is on this plane." I almost laughed. No, he's going to Atlanta. His flight was out of O'Hare this morning. "Danny." Her voice got quieter. Steadier. The way she sounds when she's talking to a nervous passenger. "This is not a flight to Atlanta. This is a nonstop to Charles de Gaulle. Paris." I didn't say anything. "I saw him when we were boarding," she continued. "He's in seat 3B. Business class. And Danny, he's not alone." The Pinterest tab was still open on my laptop. Little cream-colored napkins folded into perfect swans. "What do you mean he's not alone?" I whispered. "There's a woman with him. She's in 3A. They boarded together." "There," she stopped. Chose her words carefully. "They seem very comfortable with each other." And just like that, the beautiful blue October sky outside my kitchen window meant absolutely nothing. I don't remember the exact words I said next. I think I asked her to describe the woman. I think Reese said she was younger, maybe late 20s, dark hair, pretty, wearing a camel-colored coat. I think I made Reese describe Troy, his navy blazer, his brown carry-on, the one I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago, just so I could be absolutely sure she wasn't somehow mistaken. She wasn't mistaken. Troy was not in Atlanta. Troy was on a flight to Paris, France, sitting in a luxury business class seat, next to a woman I had never seen in my life, while I sat in my kitchen in Naperville looking at Thanksgiving napkin swans. Reese had to go. She wasn't supposed to have her personal phone in the cockpit at all. She'd slipped away during a brief handoff moment, and she needed to get back. She promised to message me everything she could. She told me to breathe. I hung up the phone, and I sat very, very still for a long time. The first coherent thought I had was this. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe it's a work trip. Maybe this woman is a colleague. Maybe there's something Troy forgot to mention, a last-minute change of plans, a new client, something that would make all of this make perfect sense in about 5 minutes. So I did what any rational person would do. I called him. The phone rang 4 times. Then voicemail. Troy's confident, professional voice. You've reached Troy Whitmore. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. I hung up. Texted him. Hey, just checking in. How's Atlanta? 3 minutes later, he responded. And what he said next is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story today. He sent me a photo. A photo of a hotel lobby. A generic, beige, absolutely could be anywhere hotel lobby. And he wrote, just checked in. Crazy busy already. Miss you and the girls. Call you tonight. He sent me a fake photo. A staged, deliberate lie. While he was sitting at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, flying to Paris with another woman. That was the moment I stopped thinking there might be an explanation. And that was the moment I started making a plan. Troy doesn't know that Reese is his pilot. He has no idea that his wife's sister is flying the very plane carrying him and his secret to Paris. And Danielle is no longer crying. She's thinking. Here is something most people don't know about flight crews. They notice everything. Flight attendants and pilots are trained observers. They are watching passengers from the moment they board. They clock behavior, body language, interactions, not because they're nosy, but because their job is to manage the safety and comfort of an entire cabin full of human beings for hours at a time. You cannot do that job without paying attention. So while Troy thought he was invisible, just another businessman in a nice suit sitting in business class, the crew was watching. Reese couldn't leave the cockpit again, but she had friends. Specifically, she had Nadine, a senior flight attendant she'd flown with for 6 years, one of her closest friends in the industry, a woman who had the sharpest eyes and the most discreet professionalism of anyone Reese had ever worked with. Reese sent Nadine a message through the crew system with a very specific and very unusual request. Please keep an eye on 3A and 3B. Don't make it obvious. Just observe. I'll explain on the ground. Nadine, to her eternal credit, asked 0 questions. What she reported back to Reese over the next 7 hours was methodical, detailed, and absolutely devastating. Troy and the woman, who Nadine later confirmed was booked under the name Kelsey Farrow, were not colleagues on a work trip. Colleagues on work trips don't hold hands under the shared armrest. Colleagues don't lean in close and laugh with their faces 2 inches apart. Colleagues don't order champagne together before the plane has even reached cruising altitude. Nadine said they were careful, not affectionate in an obvious, showy way, but in the quiet, practiced way of 2 people who have been together long enough to be comfortable. The kind of comfortable that doesn't happen on a first trip. That detail hit me harder than almost anything else when Reese told me later. The practiced comfort. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake. This wasn't one bad night. This was a relationship that had been going on long enough that they had rhythms together. Long enough that they were easy with each other. Long enough that Troy felt confident booking business class seats on an international flight, sending me a fake hotel photo, and settling in with a glass of champagne like he didn't have a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him at home in Illinois. How long? That was the question eating me alive. While Troy flew to Paris, I started looking. I need to pause here and say something to anyone watching this who has ever been in this position. Who has ever felt that cold, focused clarity that comes after the shock wears off and the grief hasn't fully hit yet. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That strange, almost calm state where your hands stop shaking and your brain just starts working. Starts calculating. That is where I was. I went through our credit card statements. Not all of them. Troy handled most of our finances, which I now understand was not an accident. But I had access to one joint card we used for groceries and household expenses. I pulled up 12 months of statements. The charges were small. Smart. Cash withdrawals here and there. A hotel charge buried in what looked like a legitimate business trip to Denver. A restaurant in Chicago I didn't recognize on a night he'd told me he had a client dinner. Another hotel, this one in Milwaukee. On a weekend he'd said he was golfing with his college friend Bart. I called Bart. Right then that afternoon, from my kitchen while my girls were still at school. Bart hadn't seen Troy in 4 months. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the ceiling for a solid 2 minutes. Then I called my mother. Not to cry. Not to fall apart. I called her to ask her to pick up Lily and Avery from school and keep them at her place for dinner. I told her I had some things I needed to take care of. My mother is a smart woman. She heard something in my voice and she didn't ask a single question. She just said, I'll get them. Take your time. I had 5 more hours before Troy's plane landed in Paris. I used every single minute. By the time Reese landed at Charles de Gaulle and sent me a message from the jet bridge, he walked right past me, Danny. He didn't even look at the cockpit door. He has no idea. I had built a fairly complete picture of what my marriage had actually been for at least the past year. And I had made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer. The second was to someone Troy never, ever would have expected. Okay, if you are hooked on this story right now, do me one favor before we go to chapter 3. Hit that subscribe button. I post stories like this every single week, and I do not want you to miss what's coming next. Subscribe, and let's keep going. I did not call Troy and confront him. I know that's probably what you expected. It's what I expected of myself, honestly. I am not by nature a patient person. I am the woman who shakes her Christmas presents and Googles movie endings before the film is over. I don't like waiting. I don't like not knowing things. But here is what my lawyer told me in that first phone call, very clearly and very calmly. Do not tip him off. Do not confront him. Do not change anything about your behavior toward him. The more documentation you build before he knows you know, the better your position. So I didn't tip him off. Troy called me from Paris that evening, just like he said he would. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for 11 years, and I watched his name light up my screen, and I felt something I still don't have a perfect word for. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something colder and quieter than both. I answered. I said hello. I asked about Atlanta. He told me about his fake conference with so much easy detail that I realized he must have researched it in advance. He mentioned real session topics from the actual event. He talked about traffic on the way from the airport. He asked about the girls. I told him Lily had a spelling test, and Avery lost a tooth. I told him the house was quiet, and I was going to bed early. I told him I missed him. He said, I miss you too, babe. Thursday, okay? I'll be home before dinner. I said, sounds good. I hung up and sat there in the silence for a long time. While he was talking to me, he was in Paris. With her. I had Reese confirm the hotel when she was on her layover. She had connections, she knew people, and more importantly she was furious in that quiet, methodical pilot way that is somehow more frightening than screaming. She found out they were staying at a boutique hotel near the Marais district. Nice place. Not outrageous enough to raise flags on a credit card statement, but the kind of place you book when you want to impress someone. I spent that week doing 3 things. First, I worked with my lawyer, a woman named Patricia who came highly recommended by someone in my church group who had been through her own divorce 3 years earlier. Patricia was calm, organized, and had clearly seen everything. She didn't gasp or express sympathy unnecessarily. She just collected information and built a file. Second, I made an appointment with a financial advisor. Our money situation was more complicated than I had understood, partly because I had trusted Troy to manage it, and partly because I hadn't wanted to look too closely. That was a mistake I was not going to repeat. By Thursday I had a much clearer picture of what we had, where it was, and what I was entitled to under Illinois law. Third, and this is the part that surprised even me, I called Kelsey Farrow. I found her through a combination of the name Nadine had gotten from the manifest and some straightforward searching. She was 29. She worked in marketing. She and Troy had apparently met at an industry event about 18 months ago. Her Instagram was mostly public. There were no photos of Troy, but I found 2 images from trips, one to Napa, one to New York. Taken on weekends Troy had told me were golf trips or work obligations. She looked happy in both of them. She had no idea I existed. Or at least, that's what I thought. I called her from a number she wouldn't recognize on a Thursday morning, about 4 hours before Troy's return flight was scheduled to land at O'Hare. She answered on the 3rd ring. Is this Kelsey Farrow? I asked. Yes. Who is this? My name is Danielle Whitmore, I said. I'm Troy Whitmore's wife. The silence on the other end of that phone lasted, so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said quietly and slowly, he told me you were separated. And the final piece of the picture clicked into place. They say living well is the best revenge. I've also heard that revenge is a dish best served cold. But honestly, sitting in my kitchen that Thursday afternoon waiting for Troy to walk through the door, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I was thinking about truth. I was thinking about my daughters. And I was thinking about how a man who had lied so consistently, so elaborately, and so casually for at least 18 months would respond when the lying suddenly had nowhere left to go. Kelsey and I had talked for almost 45 minutes. She was devastated. Not dramatic, not hysterical, genuinely gutted. She had believed they were building something real. She had believed him. She had stopped dating other people. She had rearranged her life around a version of Troy Whitmore that had been carefully constructed to deceive both of us simultaneously, in different directions. She was not my enemy. She was another victim of the same con. We agreed on two things before we got off the phone. The first was that she would not contact Troy before he landed. The second was that she would be available if I needed her testimony in any legal proceeding. She agreed to both without hesitation. I cooked dinner that evening. This is the part that I think confuses people most when I tell this story. Why would I cook dinner? Why would I act normal? Why wouldn't I just have all his things in boxes on the lawn? Because Patricia told me to. And because deep down, some part of me needed to see his face when he walked in. Some part of me needed to look at the man I had spent 11 years with, who had kissed me on the forehead that Tuesday morning before flying to Paris with another woman, and I needed to see whether I could find any trace of guilt in his eyes. The girls were at my mother's again. The house was quiet. I made pasta. I opened a bottle of wine, not for him, for me. Troy's car pulled into the driveway at 6:42 p.m. He came in rolling that brown carry-on, the birthday present. He looked good. Rested. He smelled faintly like a plane, which I had always associated with his travel and his work and his life, and now suddenly had a completely different meaning. He dropped his bag in the entryway, walked into the kitchen and smiled at me. "Hey, babe." He kissed my cheek. "Something smells good." "Pasta," I said. "How was Atlanta?" "Long." He loosened his tie, sat down at the island. "Good conference, though. I think we're going to close the Henderson account." He poured himself a glass of the wine I'd opened. He talked about Henderson. He talked about flight delays. He asked where the girls were, and I said my mom's, and he nodded like that was perfectly fine and ordinary. And then he said, "I missed you." I set down my fork. I looked at him across the island. This man I had loved, this man I had built a life with, this man who had just spent 4 days in Paris with someone else, and was currently sitting in our kitchen talking about a fake conference. And I said very calmly, "How was Paris?" The wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time since he walked in. And I watched something happen in his face that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was calculation. Even in that moment, even caught, he was calculating. "What?" he said. "Paris," I said again. "The hotel near the Marais. How was it?" He put the wine glass down. "Danny. Reese was your pilot," I said. And that was the moment the calculation stopped. Because there was no way to calculate around that. There was no version of the story that survived the detail that his wife's sister had flown the plane, seen him board with Kelsey Farrow, and spent 7 hours at altitude collecting evidence on behalf of the woman sitting across from him right now. He opened his mouth. Closed it. "How long?" I asked. My voice was steady. I want you to know it was completely steady. He looked at the countertop. "Danny." "How long, Troy?" A pause. Then, "About a year and a half. 18 months. I'd suspected it. Hearing it confirmed still felt like the floor dropping out from under me. "She thought we were separated," I said. He flinched. "I talked to her today," I said. "She seemed lovely, actually. Very sorry. She didn't know about me." The color left his face. "I also talked to a lawyer," I said. "And a financial advisor. And I've spent the last 4 days documenting everything I found in our credit card statements, cross-referencing your travel dates, and building a complete picture of the last 18 months. Patricia, she's my lawyer, you'll be hearing from her, says we're in a strong position." I stood up, picked up my wine glass. "I'm going to my mother's to be with my daughters. There's pasta on the stove. The guest room sheets are clean. Danny, please, can we just talk about this?" I stopped in the doorway and I looked back at him one more time. "Troy," I said, "you have been talking to me every single day for a year and a half, and nothing you said was true. I think we are done talking." I picked up my purse and I walked out the door. I want to be honest with you about this last chapter, because I think too many stories like mine get wrapped up in a way that feels satisfying, but isn't quite true. The truth is messy. The truth takes time. The truth doesn't always arrive with a clean bow on it. But some parts of my truth are worth telling exactly as they happened. When I got to my mother's house that night, I sat on her porch with a cup of tea while Lily and Avery slept inside, and I called Reese. She was still on her layover in Paris, she'd worked an overnight turnaround, and she answered immediately. "I told him," I said. "How'd he take it?" "About how you'd expect." She was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," I said. And that was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone all week. What Troy did next, the move I mentioned, was not violent, not dangerous. But it was revealing in a way that I think matters. Within an hour of me leaving, he called my mother's house directly. Not my cell phone, my mother's landline, which almost no one uses anymore. He must have looked it up. He spoke to my mother, and he cried, and he asked to speak to me, and my mother, this quiet, dignified 61-year-old woman who had never once spoken a harsh word to Troy in 11 years, said very politely, "I'm sorry, Troy. She's not available." And she hung up. I'm not going to lie. That was one of the most comforting things that happened that entire week. Troy moved out within the month. He went willingly, in the end, partly because Patricia was very good at her job, and partly because I think some part of Troy was relieved. People who maintain double lives carry a weight that eventually becomes unbearable. I think he was tired of managing it. Kelsey ended things with him the same week he moved out. She messaged me once, about 3 months later, just to say she hoped I was doing okay. I told her I was. I meant it. The divorce took 8 months. It was not easy. I won't pretend it was. There were nights I cried until I couldn't breathe. There were mornings I laid in bed unable to face the particular shape of a day that was no longer the day I thought I was living. There were moments, more than I'd like to admit, where I questioned myself. Where I replayed a decade of memories and wondered which parts were real, which parts were performance, and whether I'd ever be able to trust my own judgment again. But here's what I also want you to know. Lily and Avery are doing well. Kids are resilient in ways that will genuinely humble you if you let them. We told them the truth, age-appropriately, that Mom and Dad had grown apart and things had changed, and that none of it was their fault, and that both of us loved them completely. Lily, who is 9, told me very seriously one night, "Mom, I think you're going to be okay." I don't think I've ever loved her more than in that moment. Reese came home for Christmas. We sat in my new apartment, a 2-bedroom I rented after we sold the house, on the 3rd floor, with a balcony that faces west and is stunning at sunset, and we drank wine and talked for hours. At one point she said, "I'm sorry I called you." And I'm not sorry I called you. I told her she was the best person I knew. She said, "I broke about 4 regulations making that call." I said, "Worth it." She laughed, and I laughed, and outside the window the sun went down over the Illinois suburbs in all its orange and red glory, and I sat there in my own apartment, in my own life, and I thought, I am going to be okay. Not perfect. Not immediately. Not without grief and work and time. But okay. Here is the thing about being lied to. The thing nobody tells you before it happens to you. The lie doesn't just hurt you in the moment. It reaches backward into your past and rewrites things. Events you thought you understood suddenly have new meaning. Conversations you've replayed 1,000 times shift under your feet. That is genuinely one of the hardest things to survive. Not the discovery, but the rewriting. What carries you through it, at least what carried me, is the people who never lied to you. My sister, who broke protocol at 37,000 feet to protect me. My mother, who said she's not available and hung up the phone. My daughters, who crawled into my bed on hard nights without being asked, because somehow they always knew. Patricia, who was calm and precise and absolutely on my side. You survive it because of them. You build something new because of yourself. Today, I am 8 months out of that marriage. I have a job I'm proud of. I have an apartment with a west-facing balcony. I have 2 daughters who are funny and weird and wonderful. I have a sister who is, at this very moment, probably flying over some ocean somewhere, watching over a cabin full of people who have no idea how lucky they are to have her. And I have this story, this community, this space where I can say the things out loud that I couldn't say back then. If you're going through something similar right now, I see you. It doesn't feel survivable in the early days. It is. And if you're just here for the story, I see you too. Thank you for being here. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me what part hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? New stories every week. I'll see you in the next one.